congressional opponents of Aristide now had a rationale for trying to limit the extent of U.S. support to him, and some of them argued that the United States should not embroil itself in Haiti on behalf of such a leader. He, Littell, made it the most simplistic, one-dimensional message he could. "Murderer, psychopath," said an administration official familiar with Littell's briefing. In 1960, the Eisenhower administration had regarded another black foreign leader who didn't buy into Pax Americana, Patrice Lumumba, as unstable, irrational, almost psychotic. Nelson Mandela was often described in a similar fashion by his opponents. Some of those who make such charges may indeed believe that conspicuously rejecting the established order is a sign of insanity. The junta, which was concerned that President Clinton might order military action against Haiti, was pleased. A spokesman observed that after the information about Aristide got out from our friends in the CIA, and Congress started talking about how bad he is, we figured the chances of an invasion were gone. Though the Clinton administration publicly repudiated the claims about Aristide's mental health in no uncertain terms, it nonetheless continued to negotiate with Haiti's military leaders, a policy which stunned supporters of the Catholic priest. Apparently, marveled Robert White, a former U.S. ambassador to El Salvador and an unpaid advisor to Aristide. Nothing will shake the touching faith the Clinton administration has in the Haitian military's bona fides. Aristide supporters asserted that such faith reflected long and continuing relations between American military officers and Haiti's top commanders, Cedras and Francois, the police chief, both of whom had received military training in the United States. Time magazine suggested that the U.S. attitude toward some of Haiti's henchmen is not as hostile as American rhetoric would indicate. This attitude was commented upon by the Lawyers' Committee for Human Rights. Faced with Aristide's talk of radical reform, an old and deep-rooted American instinct has taken hold. Repeated in countless countries, both during and after the Cold War, it is this: when in doubt, look to the military as the only institutional guarantee of stability and order. It had indeed been to the military that the Reagan and Bush administrations had looked to provide these qualities, praising the sincerity of the Haitian Army's commitment to democracy on several occasions. The Clinton administration was as hypocritical on the Haiti question as were its predecessors, exemplified by its choice for Secretary of Commerce. Ron Brown had been a well-paid and highly active lobbyist for Baby Doc Duvalier. Cedras' spit-in-the-face deceit on the Governor's Island Accord appeared to bother Washington officials much less than the fact that Aristide would not agree to form a government with the military. By February 1994, it was an open secret that Washington would as soon be rid of the Haitian priest as it would the Haitian strongmen. The Los Angeles Times reported, "Officially the U.S. supports the restoration of Aristide. In private, however, many officials say that Aristide is so politically radical that the military and the island's affluent elite will never allow him to return to power. Ideologically, if not emotionally, the antipathy of the administration's senior officials to Aristide's politics was hardly less than that of his country's ruling class. Moreover, the predominant reason the strongmen were in disfavor in Washington's eyes had little to do with their dreadful human rights record per se, but rather that the repression in Haiti was provoking people to flee by the tens of thousands, causing the United States an enormous logistical headache and image problem in the Caribbean and Florida, as well as costing hundreds of millions of dollars. The gulf between the administration and Aristide widened yet further when Secretary of State Warren Christopher announced that a group of Haitian parliamentarians, whom he characterized as centrists, had put forth a plan which would pardon the army officers who engineered the coup, and which called for Aristide to name a prime minister, who in turn would create a cabinet acceptable to Aristide's domestic foes. These steps, the plan anticipated, would establish a coalition government and clear the way for Aristide's eventual return to office. Aristide, who had not been consulted at all, flatly rejected the proposal that would have allowed some awful villains to escape punishment, made no mention of a date or timetable for his restoration, contained no guarantee that he would ever be able to return to power at all, and would require him to share power with a politically incompatible prime minister and some cabinet members of similar ilk. Christopher added that any strengthening of the embargo against Haiti would depend on Aristide's acceptance of the plan. The United States, he said, was wary of tougher sanctions because they would increase the suffering in Haiti. At the same time, the State Department's chief Haiti expert, Michael Kozak, blamed extremists on both sides for scuttling the plan. This, said a Haitian supporter of Aristide, created a moral equivalency between Aristide and the military that put Aristide on the same level as the killers. The Bush administration, employing the UN and the OAS as well, had pressed similar proposals and ultimatums upon the beleaguered Aristide on several occasions. His failure to embrace them had stamped him as intransigent amongst some officials and media. Aristide's rejection of the plan can perhaps be better understood if one considers whether Washington would ever insist to the Cuban exiles in Miami that if they wanted U.S. support for their return to Cuba, they would have to agree to a coalition government with Castroites, or that Iraqian exiles would have to learn to live with Saddam Hussein. The repeated insistence that Aristide accept a broad-based government or a government of national consensus is ironic coming from the Bush and Clinton administrations, in which one cannot find an open left liberal, much less a leftist or socialist, scarcely even a plain genuine liberal in any high-level position. Nor has the severe suffering of the Cuban people from the American embargo had any noticeable effect upon the policy of either administration. It soon developed that the plan, which had been labeled a bipartisan Haitian legislative initiative, had actually originated with a State Department memo. Worse, the Haitian input had come from supporters of Aristide's overthrow, including Police Chief Francois himself. A further symptom of the administration's estrangement from Aristide was a report from the U.S. Embassy in Haiti to the State Department in April. While conceding widespread and grave violations of human rights by the military regime, the report claimed that Aristide and his followers consistently manipulate and even fabricate human rights abuses as a propaganda tool. The Aristide camp was described as hardline ideological. Congressional liberals, particularly the Congressional Black Caucus, were becoming disturbed. In the midst of their growing criticism and pressure, State Department Special Envoy to Haiti Lawrence Petzullo, by this time openly described as the author of the legislative plan, resigned. A week later, several congressmen, attended by wide media coverage, were arrested in a protest outside the White House. By early May, given the congressional pressure, the Grand Haitian Plan discredited and abandoned, the sanctions an international joke, the refugees still washing up on Florida shores, while many thousands of others were filling up Guantanamo Base in Cuba, the Clinton administration was forced to the conclusion that, though they still didn't like this man Jean-Bertrand Aristide with his non-centrist thoughts, they were unable to create anything that smelled even faintly like a rose without. Restoring him to the presidency. Bill Clinton had painted himself into a corner. During the campaign in 1992, he had denounced Bush's policy of returning refugees to Haiti as cruel. "My administration," he declared, "will stand up for democracy." Since that time, the word Haiti could not cross his lips without being accompanied by at least 3 platitudes about democracy. Something had to be done, or another foreign policy failure would be added to the list the Republicans were drooling over in this election year. But what? Over the next 4 months, the world was treated to a continuous flip-flop, numerous permutations concerning sanctions, handling of the refugees, how much time the junta had to pack up and leave, as much as 6 months, what kind of punishment or amnesty for the murderous military and police, whether the U.S. would invade. This time we mean it. Now we really mean it. Our patience has run out. For the 3rd time, we will not rule out military force. For the 5th time. The junta was not terribly intimidated. Meanwhile, an OAS human rights team was accusing the Haiti regime of murder, rape, kidnapping, detention, and torture in a systematic campaign to terrorize Haitians who want the return of democracy and President Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And Amnesty International was reporting the same. Time was passing, and each day meant less time for Aristide to govern Haiti. He had already lost almost 3 of the 5 years of his term, plus the 8 months he had served. By the summer, what Bill Clinton wanted desperately was to get the junta out of power without having to deal with the thorny question of congressional approval, without a U.S. invasion, without any American casualties, without going to war on behalf of a socialist priest. If Washington's heart had really been set on the return to power of Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the CIA could have been directed to destabilize the Haitian government any time during the previous 3 years, using its tried and trusted bribery, blackmail, and forged documents, its disinformation, rumors, and paranoia, its weapons, mercenaries, and assassinations, its multinational economic strangleholds, its instant little armies, its selective little air assaults imbuing the right amount of terror in the right people at the right time. The agency had done so with much stronger and more stable governments. governments with much more public support, from Iran and Guatemala to Ecuador and Brazil to Ghana and Chile. Much of what was needed in Haiti was already in place, beginning with the CIA's own creation, the National Intelligence Service, as well as a large network of informants and paid assets within other security forces such as FRAF, and knowledge of who the reliable military officers were. US intelligence even had a complete inventory of Haitian weaponry. The failure of Clinton to make use of this option is particularly curious in light of the fact that many members of Congress and some of the administration's own foreign policy specialists were urging him to do so for months. Finally, in September 1994, officials revealed that the CIA had launched a major covert operation this month to try to topple Haiti's military regime. But so far, the attempt has failed. One official said the effort was too late to make a difference. The administration, we were told, had spent months debating what kind of actions to undertake and whether they would be legal or not. Or they could have made the famous one phone call, like they meant it. Betrayal. The most violent regime in our hemisphere. Campaign of rape, torture, and mutilation. People starved. Executing children. Raping women. Killing priests. Slaying of Haitian orphans, suspected of harboring sympathy toward President Aristide, for no other reason than he ran an orphanage in his days as a parish priest. Soldiers and policemen raping the wives and daughters of suspected political dissidents. Young girls, 13, 16 years old. People slain and mutilated with body parts left as warnings to terrify others. Children forced to watch as their mothers' faces are slashed with machetes. Thus spaketh William Jefferson Clinton to the American people to explain why he was seeking to restore democratic government in Haiti. The next thing we knew, the Haitian leaders were told that they could take 4 weeks to resign. They would not be charged with any crimes. They could remain in the country if they wished. They could run for the presidency if they wished. They could retain all their assets no matter how acquired. Those who chose exile were paid large amounts of money by the United States to lease their Haitian properties. Any improvements made to remain free of charge. 2 jets were chartered to fly them with all their furniture to the country of their choice, transportation free, housing and living expenses paid for the next year for all family members and dozens of relatives and friends, totaling millions of dollars. The reason Bill Clinton, the president, as opposed perhaps to Bill Clinton, the human being, could behave like this is that he, as would be the case with any other man sitting in the White House, like Jimmy Carter, who told Cedras that he was a man of honor and that he had great respect for him, was not actually repulsed by Cedras and company, for they posed no ideological barrier to the United States continuing the economic and strategic control of Haiti it's maintained for most of the century. Unlike Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a man who only a year earlier had declared, "I still think capitalism is a mortal sin," or Fidel Castro in Cuba. Lest there be doubt here, it should be noted that shortly before Clinton made the remarks cited above, Vice President Gore declared on television that Castro has a worse record on human rights than the military leaders of Haiti. The atrocities of the Haitian government were simply trotted out by President Clinton to build support for military intervention, just as he cited the junta's drug trafficking. After all these years, this was now discovered, as Noriega's longtime dealings were finally condemned when it was time for a military intervention into Panama. But the worst of the betrayal was yet to come. Per the above agreement with Raul Cedras, U.S. armed forces began arriving in Haiti September 19th to clear the way for Aristide's arrival in mid-October. The Americans were welcomed with elation by the Haitian people, and the GIs soon disarmed, arrested, or shot dead some of the worst dangers to life and limb and instigators of chaos in Haitian society. But first they set up tanks and vehicles mounted with machine guns to block off the streets leading to the residential neighborhoods of the morally repugnant elite, the rich being Washington's natural allies. Jean-Bertrand Aristide's reception was a joyous celebration filled with optimism. However, unbeknownst to his adoring followers, while they were regaining Aristide, they may have lost Aristidism. The Los Angeles Times reported, in a series of private meetings, administration officials admonished Aristide to put aside the rhetoric of class warfare and seek instead to reconcile Haiti's rich and poor. The administration also urged Aristide to stick closely to free market economics and to abide by the Caribbean nation's constitution, which gives substantial political power to the parliament while imposing tight limits on the presidency. Administration officials have urged Aristide to reach out to some of his political opponents in setting up his new government, to set up a broad-based coalition regime. The administration has made it clear to Aristide that if he fails to reach a consensus with Parliament, the United States will not try to prop up his regime. Almost every aspect of Aristide's plans for resuming power, from taxing the rich to disarming the military, has been examined by the US officials with whom the Haitian president meets daily and by officials from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other aid organizations. The finished package clearly reflects their priorities. Aristide obviously has toned down the liberation theology and class struggle rhetoric that was his signature before he was exiled to Washington. Tutored by leading Clinton administration officials, Aristide has embraced the principles of democracy, national reconciliation, and market economics with a zeal that Washington would like to see in all leaders of developing nations. Aristide returned to Haiti October 15, 1994, 3 years and 2 weeks after being deposed. The United States might well have engineered his return under the same terms, or much better, of course, 2 to 3 years earlier, but Washington officials kept believing that the policy of returning refugees to Haiti, and when that was unfeasible, lodging them at Guantanamo, would make the problems go away, the refugee problem and the Jean-Bertrand Aristide problem. Faced ultimately with an Aristide returning to power, Clinton demanded and received, and then made sure to publicly announce, the Haitian president's guarantee that he would not try to remain in office to make up for the time lost in exile. Clinton, of course, called this democracy, although it represented a partial legitimization of the coup. As can be deduced from the above compilation of news reports, this was by no means the only option Aristide effectively surrendered. His preference for the all-important position of Prime Minister, who appoints the cabinet, was Claudette Worlay, a woman very much in harmony with his thinking, but he was forced to rule her out because of strong opposition to her leftist bent from political opponents who argued that she would seriously hurt efforts to obtain foreign aid and investment. Instead, Aristide wound up appointing Marc Michel, one of Washington's leading choices. At the same time, the Clinton administration and the international financial institutions, IFIs, were carefully watching the Haitian president's appointments for finance minister, planning minister, and head of the central bank. 2 of the men favored by Washington to fill these positions had met in Paris on August 22nd with the IFIs to arrange the terms of an agreement under which Haiti would receive about $700 million of investment and credit. Typical of such agreements for the Third World, it calls for a drastic reduction of state involvement in the economy and an enlarged role for the private sector through privatization of public services. Haiti's international function will be to serve the transnational corporations by opening itself up further to foreign investment and commerce, with a bare minimum of tariffs or other import restrictions, and offering itself, primarily in the assembly industries, as a source of cheap export labor, extremely cheap labor, little if any increase in the current 10 to 25 cents per hour wages, distressingly inadequate for keeping body and soul together and hunger at bay. A way of life promoted for years to investors by the U.S. Agency for International Development and other U.S. government agencies. The assembly industries are regarded by Washington as important enough to American firms that in the midst of the sanctions against Haiti, the U.S. announced that it was fine-tuning the embargo to permit these firms to import and export so they could resume work. The agreement further emphasizes that the power of the parliament is to be strengthened. The office of the president is not even mentioned. Neither is the word justice. As of this writing, late October 1994, Aristide's dreams of a living wage and civilized working conditions for the Haitian masses, a social security pension system, decent education, housing, health care, public transportation, etc. appear to be little more than that dreams. What appears to be certain is that the rich will grow richer, and the poor will remain at the very bottom of Latin America's heap. Under Aristide's successor, whomever the United States is already grooming, it can only get worse. Aristide, the radical reformer, knew all this, and at certain points during September and October, he may have had the option to get a much better deal, for Clinton needed him almost as much as he needed Clinton. If Aristide had threatened to go public, and noisily so, about the betrayal in process, spelling out all the sleazy details so that the whole world could get beyond the headline platitudes and understand what a sham Bill Clinton's expressed concerns about democracy and the welfare of the Haitian people were, the American president would have been faced with an embarrassment of scandalous proportion. But Aristide the priest saw the world in a different light. Let us compare political power with theological power. On the one hand, we see those in control using the traditional tools of politics. weapons, money, dictatorship, coups d'etat, repression. On the other hand, we see tools that were used 2,000 years ago. Solidarity, resistance, courage, determination, and the fight for dignity and might, respect and power. We see transcendence. We see faith in God, who is justice. The question we now ask is this: which is stronger, political power or theological power? I am confident that the latter is stronger. I am also confident that the two forces can converge, and that their convergence will make the critical difference. 56. The American Empire, 1992 to present. We assert that no nation can long endure half republic and half empire, and we warn the American people that imperialism abroad will lead quickly and inevitably to despotism at home. Democratic Party, U.S. National Platform, 1900. Following its bombing of Iraq in 1991, the United States wound up with military bases in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. Following its bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, the United States wound up with military bases in Kosovo, Albania, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Hungary, Bosnia, and Croatia. Following its bombing of Afghanistan in 2001-2, the United States wound up with military bases in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Yemen, and Djibouti. Following its bombing and invasion of Iraq in 2003, the United States wound up with Iraq. This is not very subtle foreign policy, certainly not covert. The men who run the American empire are not easily embarrassed. And that is the way the empire grows. A base in every neighborhood, ready to be mobilized to put down any threat to imperial rule, real or imagined. 58 years after World War II ended, the United States still has major bases in Germany and Japan. 50 years after the end of the Korean War, tens of thousands of American armed forces continue to be stationed in South Korea. America will have a continuing interest and presence in Central Asia of a kind that we could not have dreamed of before. U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell declared in February 2002. Later that year, the U.S. Defense Department announced, "The United States military is currently deployed to more locations than it has been throughout history." Equally unsubtle are the announcements beginning in the early 1990s, coinciding with the pivotal demise of the Soviet Union, and continuing to the present, trumpeting Washington's desire, means, and intention for world domination, while assuring the world of the noble purposes behind this crusade. These declarations have been regularly put forth in policy papers emanating from the White House and the Pentagon, as well as from government-appointed commissions and think tanks closely associated with the national security establishment. Here is the voice of the empire in 1992. Our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order of that posed formerly by the Soviet Union. We must account sufficiently for the interests of the advanced industrial nations to discourage them from challenging our leadership or seeking to overturn the established political and economic order. We must maintain the mechanisms for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. 1996. We will engage terrestrial targets someday. Ships, airplanes, land targets from space. We're going to fight in space. We're going to fight from space, and we're going to fight into space. 1997. With regard to space dominance, we have it, we like it, and we're going to keep it. 2000. The new military preparedness standard is to maintain military superiority over all potential rivals, and to prepare now for future military rivalries, even if they cannot yet be identified and their eventual arrival is only speculative. Military requirements have become detached from net assessments of actual security threats. Generic wars and generic capabilities are proffered as the basis for planning. Particularities of real threat scenarios have become secondary to the generalized need to show raw U.S. power across the globe. 2001. The presence of American forces in critical regions around the world is the visible expression of the extent of America's status as a superpower and as the guarantor of liberty, peace, and stability. 2001. If we just let our own vision of the world go forth and we embrace it entirely, and we don't try to be clever and piece together clever diplomatic solutions to this thing, but just wage a total war against these tyrants, I think we will do very well, and our children will sing great songs about us years from now. 2001. The Bush administration's Nuclear Posture Review, directing the military to prepare contingency plans to use nuclear weapons against at least 7 countries: China, Russia, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Libya, and Syria, and to build smaller nuclear weapons for use in certain battlefield situations. 2002. In September, the White House issued its National Security Strategy, which declared, "Our forces will be strong enough to dissuade potential adversaries from pursuing a military buildup in hopes of surpassing or equaling the power of the United States. America will act against such emerging threats before they are fully formed. We must deter and defend against the threat before it is unleashed. We cannot let our enemies strike first. To forestall or prevent such hostile acts by our adversaries, the United States will, if necessary, act preemptively." Preemptiveness is essentially the rationale Imperial Japan, without being overly paranoid, used to justify its attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and which Nazi Germany, as a sham pretext, used to justify its invasion of Poland in 1939. To one observer, the meaning of the National Security Strategy was this: it dashes the aspirations of those who had hoped that the world was moving toward a system of international law that would allow for the peaceful resolution of conflicts through covenants and courts. In place of this, a single power that shuns covenants and courts has proclaimed that it intends to dominate the world militarily, intervening preemptively where necessary to exorcise threats. Those who want a world in which no power is supreme and in which laws and covenants are used to settle conflicts will begin a new debate about how to contend with Imperial America. So intoxicated with the idea of dominance is the U.S. national security state that when it announced, in November 2002, the formation of a public affairs group that would travel to battlefields to interact with journalists, assist U.S. commanders, and send news and pictures back to headquarters for dissemination. It described the operation as an attempt at information dominance. The Cold War is over. Long live the Cold War. It is remarkable indeed that in the 21st century, the government of the United States is still going around dropping huge amounts of exceedingly powerful explosives upon the heads of innocent and defenseless people. It wasn't supposed to be this way. In the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms instituted the beginning of the end for the Soviet police state. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and people all over Eastern Europe were joyfully celebrating a new day. The United States then joined this celebration by invading and bombing Panama, only weeks after the wall fell. At the same time, the U.S. was shamelessly intervening in the election in Nicaragua to defeat a leftist government. Soon thereafter, South Africa freed Nelson Mandela and apartheid began to crumble. And before the year 1990 was over, Haiti held its first free election ever and chose a genuine progressive as president. It seemed like anything was possible. Optimism was as widespread as pessimism is today. However, when Bulgaria and Albania, newly freed from the grip of communism, as the American media would put it, dared to elect governments not acceptable to Washington, Washington just stepped in and overthrew those governments. The same period found the U.S. bombing Iraq and its people 40 days and nights without mercy, for no good or honest reason. And that was that for our hope for a different and better world. But the American leaders were not through. In 1993, they were off attacking Somalia, trying to rearrange the country's political map. More bombing and killing. They intervened to put down dissident movements in Peru, Mexico, Colombia, and Ecuador, just as if it were the Cold War in the 1950s in Latin America, and the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, still doing it in the 1990s and into the new century. In the latter part of the 1990s, Washington could be found engaged in serious meddling in the elections in territories which had once been part of the Soviet sphere: Russia, Mongolia, and Bosnia. In 1999, they bombed the people of Serbia and Kosovo for 78 seemingly endless days, the culmination of Washington's master plan of breaking up the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, demonized as the last of the communists. And once again, in the fall of 2001, grossly and openly intervened in an election in Nicaragua to prevent the left from winning. At the same time, bombarding Afghanistan, and in all likelihood killing more innocent civilians than were killed in the United States on September 11, 2001, as well as taking the lives of countless combatants, i.e., anyone who defended against the invasion of the land they were living in. Most of the so-called terrorists of foreign nationality residing in Afghanistan at the time, including those training at al-Qaeda camps, had come there to fight against the Soviet forces or to help the Taliban in their later civil war. For them, these were religious missions, nothing to do with terrorism or the United States. Amongst the thousands of victims of the American invasion, not one has been identified as having a connection to the events of that tragic day. The September 11th terrorists had chosen symbolic buildings to attack, and the United States then chose a symbolic country to retaliate against. While continuing to savage Afghanistan in 2002, Washington found time to lend its indispensable support to a plot to overthrow Hugo Chavez and his populist government in Venezuela, Chavez having made it abundantly clear that Venezuela was not prepared to become a foreign outpost of the empire. And all these years, still keeping a chokehold on Cuba. Still, after a century of imperialist occupation, refusing to vacate Guantanamo Base in Cuba, converting it in 2002 to a modern Devil's Island for the illegal and grim imprisonment of men, as well as several children, kidnapped in various localities of the world in the so-called War on Terrorism. There was none of the peace dividend that had been promised for the end of the Cold War, not for Americans nor for the rest of the world. What do we have here? The American people had been taught for nearly half a century that the Cold War, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the huge military budgets, all the US invasions and overthrows of governments, the ones they knew about, they were taught that this was all to fight the same menace, the international communist conspiracy headquarters in Moscow. But then the Soviet Union was dissolved. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved as well. The East European satellites became independent. The former communists even became capitalists. And nothing changed in American foreign policy. Even NATO remained, NATO which had been created, so we were told, to protect Western Europe against a Soviet invasion. Even NATO remained, ever increasing in size and military power, a treaty on wheels which could be rolled in any direction to suit Washington's current policy. Acting as a US surrogate ruling over the Balkans as a protectorate, invoking its charter to justify its members joining the US in the Afghanistan invasion. And as Russia closed down its Cold War bases in Eastern Europe, Vietnam, and Cuba, the United States was opening military bases in the territories of the former Soviet Union and in other regions of the world. While Russia closed down its radio intelligence station at Lourdes, Cuba, the United States was building a powerful communications listening station in Latvia, on the Russian border, as part of Washington's worldwide eavesdropping system. The whole thing had been a con game. The Soviet Union and something called communism per se had not been the object of Washington's global attacks. There had never been an international communist conspiracy. The enemy was, and remains, any government or movement or even individual that stands in the way of the expansion of the American empire. By whatever name the US gives to the enemy, communist, rogue state, drug trafficker, terrorist, is the United States against terrorism? Are we now to believe that the American empire is against terrorism? What does one call a man who blows up an airplane killing 73 civilians for political reasons? Who attempts assassinations against several diplomats? Who fires cannons at ships docked in American ports? Who places bombs in numerous commercial and diplomatic buildings in the US and abroad? Dozens of such acts. His name is Orlando Bosch. He's Cuban and he lives in Miami, unmolested by the authorities. The city of Miami once declared a day in his honor, Dr. Orlando Bosch Day. He was freed from prison in Venezuela in 1988, where he had been held for the airplane bombing, partly because after Bosch returned to the US in 1988, the Justice Department condemned him as a totally violent terrorist and was all set to deport him, but that was blocked by President Bush the first with the help of son Jeb Bush in Florida. So is President Bush the second and his family against terrorism? Well, yes, they're against those terrorists who are not allies of the empire. The plane that Bosch bombed in 1976 was a Cuban plane. He's wanted in Cuba for that and a host of other serious crimes, and the Cubans have asked Washington to extradite him. To Cuba, he's like Osama bin Laden is to the United States, but the US has refused. Imagine the reaction in the United States if bin Laden showed up in Havana and the Cubans refused to turn him over. Imagine the reaction in the United States if Havana proclaimed Osama bin Laden Day. Washington's commitment to fighting terrorism can be further questioned in light of its support of the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo who comprise the Kosovo Liberation Army. The KLA, in furtherance of its political ethnic agenda, have carried out numerous terrorist attacks for years in various parts of the Balkans. but they've been US allies because they've attacked people out of favor with Washington. This despite the fact that the KLA has had ideological and personal ties to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and despite being categorized as a terrorist organization by the US State Department. Moreover, in the 1980s and 90s, anti-communist Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians resident in the United States financed and instigated their countrymen abroad in bombings and other attacks on their governments and citizens, hoping to destabilize those governments. At times they traveled from the US to those countries to carry out attacks themselves. These actions, terrorism by definition, were carried out with the tacit approval of the American government, which turned a blind eye to the Neutrality Act, which prohibits American citizens or residents from using force to overthrow a foreign government. George W. Bush has also spoken out vehemently against harboring terrorists. Those who harbor terrorists threaten the national security of the United States. Does he really mean that? We must ask, which country harbors more terrorists than the United States? Orlando Bosch is only one of the numerous anti-Castro Cubans in Miami who have carried out many hundreds of terrorist acts in the US, in Cuba, and elsewhere. All kinds of arson attacks, assassination attempts, and bombings. They have been harbored in the US in safety for decades, as have numerous other friendly terrorists, torturers, and human rights violators from Guatemala, El Salvador, Haiti, Indonesia, and elsewhere, all allies of the empire. The CIA was busy looking for terrorists in caves in the mountains of Afghanistan at the same time as the agency sat in bars in Miami having drinks with terrorists. The Imperial Mafia. What are we to make of all this? How are we to understand United States foreign policy? Well, if one were to write a book called The American Empire for Dummies, page 1 should say, don't ever look for the moral factor. US foreign policy has no moral factor built into its DNA. One must clear one's mind of that baggage which only gets in the way of seeing beyond the cliches and the platitudes. It's rather difficult for most Americans and Americophiles throughout the world to accept such a notion. They see American leaders on television smiling and laughing, telling jokes. They see them with their families, hear them speak of God and love, of peace and law, of democracy and freedom, of human rights and justice, and even baseball. These leaders know how to condemn the world's atrocities in no uncertain terms, with just the right words that decent people love to hear, just the right catch in their throat to show how moved they are. How can such people be monsters? How can they be called immoral? They have names like George and Dick and Donald, not a single Muhammad or Abdullah in the bunch. And they all speak English. People named Muhammad or Abdullah cut off people's hands as punishment for theft. Americans know that that's horrible. Americans are too civilized for that. But people named George and Dick and Donald drop cluster bombs on cities and villages, and the many unexploded ones become landmines, and before very long a child picks one up or steps on one of them and loses an arm or a leg, or both arms or both legs, and sometimes their eyesight, while the cluster bombs which actually explode create their own kind of high-velocity, jagged steel horror. But these men are perhaps not so much immoral as they are amoral. It's not that they take pleasure in causing so much death and suffering. It's that they just don't care. The same that could be said about a sociopath. As long as the death and suffering advance the agenda of the empire, as long as the right people and the right corporations gain wealth and power and privilege and prestige, as long as the death and suffering aren't happening to them or people close to them, then they just don't care about it happening to other people, including the American soldiers whom they throw into wars and who come home, the ones who make it back alive, with Agent Orange or Gulf War syndrome eating away at their bodies. American leaders would not be in the positions they hold if they were bothered by such things. When I was writing my book Rogue State during 1999 to 2000, I used the term American Empire with some caution because it was not in common usage and I wasn't sure the American public was quite ready for the idea. But I needn't have been so cautious. The idea of United States world hegemony has come to be discussed not only openly, but proudly by supporters of the empire, prominent American intellectuals such as Dinesh D'Souza of the Hoover Institution, who wrote an article entitled In Praise of American Empire, in which he argued that America is the most magnanimous imperial power ever. Syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer has spoken of America's uniquely benign imperium. Michael Hirsch, editor of Newsweek magazine, added to the chorus of self-love songs with this: U.S. allies must accept that some U.S. unilateralism is inevitable, even desirable. This mainly involves accepting the reality of America's supreme might, and truthfully, appreciating how historically lucky they are to be protected by such a relatively benign power. Robert Kagan, a leading light of the American foreign policy establishment, had written earlier, "And the truth is that the benevolent hegemony exercised by the United States is good for a vast portion of the world's population. It is certainly a better international arrangement than all realistic alternatives. In this way are people who are wedded to American foreign policy able to live with it. They conclude and proclaim and may even believe that such policies produce a humane force, an enlightened empire, bringing order, prosperity, and civilized behavior everywhere. And if the US is forced to go to war, it conducts it in a humanitarian manner." As the reader will have noted, the present book documents in minute detail the exact opposite, showing the remarkable violence and cruelty, the suppression of social change, and the many other abhorrent consequences of US interventions for people in every corner of the globe for half a century. The empire's scribes appear to be as amoral as the officials in the White House and the Pentagon. After all, the particles of depleted uranium are not lodging inside their lungs to radiate for the rest of their lives. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund are not bankrupting their economy and slashing their basic services. It's not their families wandering as refugees in the desert. The leaders of the empire, the Imperial Mafia, George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Cheney, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl et al., and their scribes as well, are as fanatic and as fundamentalist as Osama bin Laden. Allah Akbar. God is great. USA. 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 Kagan, an intellectual architect of an interventionism that seeks to impose a neoconservative agenda upon the world, by any means necessary, has declared that the United States must refuse to abide by certain international conventions, like the International Criminal Court and the Kyoto Accord on Global Warming. The US, he says, must support arms control, but not always for itself. It must live by a double standard. There is also Robert Cooper, a senior British diplomat and advisor to Prime Minister Tony Blair. Cooper writes, "The challenge to the postmodern world is to get used to the idea of double standards. When dealing with more old-fashioned kinds of states outside the postmodern continent of Europe, we need to revert to the rougher methods of an earlier era, force, preemptive attack, deception, whatever is necessary to deal with those who still live in the 19th century world of every state for itself." His expression, "every state for itself," can be better understood as any state not willing to accede to the agenda of the American empire and the school bully's best friend in London. So there we have it. The double standard is in. The golden rule of do unto others as you would have others do unto you is out. The Imperial Mafia and their court intellectuals like Kagan and Cooper have a difficult time selling or defending their world vision on the basis of legal, moral, ethical, or fairness standards. Thus it is that they decide they're not bound by such standards. The liquid gold, again. The American occupation of Afghanistan served the purpose of setting up a new government that would be sufficiently amenable to Washington's international objectives, including the installation of military bases and listening stations and the running of secure oil and gas pipelines through Afghanistan from the Caspian Sea region once the country had been pacified. For years, the American oil barons had had their eyes on the vast oil and gas reserves around the Caspian Sea, envisioning an Afghanistan-Pakistan route to the Indian Ocean. The oilmen had been quite open about this, giving frank testimony before Congress on the matter. After Afghanistan, they turned their lust to the even greater oil reserves of Iraq. Once again, the American public had to be primed. Renowned espionage novelist John le Carre has observed, "How Bush and his junta succeeded in deflecting America's anger from bin Laden to Saddam Hussein is one of the great public relations conjuring tricks of history." As this is written in April 2003, the United States has just completed the bombing, invasion, and takeover of the beleaguered Iraqi society, causing great destruction, killing thousands of innocent people, civilians and soldiers, in the process, leaving countless others maimed and otherwise ruined. "It looks like it's a bombing of a city, but it isn't," declared U.S. Secretary of War Donald Rumsfeld. In defense of American precision bombing, Washington looked at the results of its military actions, which others would call horrific, and labeled it liberation, because the Saddam Hussein regime had been overthrown. Prior to this, the Imperial Mafia had staged a year-long propaganda show to convince Americans and the world that the world's only superpower had no choice but to attack a sovereign and crippled country that had not attacked the United States, that had not threatened to attack the United States, that knew it would mean instant mass suicide for them if they attacked the United States. The Imperial Mafia's thesis was odd not simply because Iraq was not a threat, as the war's easy military victory demonstrated, but because the Imperial Mafia knew that Iraq was not a threat at all. They'd been telling the world one story after another about why Iraq was a threat, an imminent threat, a threat increasing in danger with each passing day, a nuclear threat, a chemical threat, a biological threat, that Iraq was a terrorist state, that Iraq was tied to Al-Qaeda, only to have each story amount to nothing. They insisted repeatedly that Iraq must agree to having the UN weapons inspectors back in, and when Iraq agreed to this, the Imperial Mafia declared that it wasn't good enough and proceeded to disparage the effort. For it was war that the White House yearned for, and it was war that they got, as they thumbed their nose at the greatest anti-war protests the world has ever seen, as well as the sweeping opposition of the United Nations and humanity's hard-won concepts of international law and collaboration for a more peaceful planet. It remains to be seen whether and how the world body will survive being relegated to humiliating irrelevance on the most important question that it can face, the UN being an institution which declared in the very first sentence of its charter the determination to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Did any of Washington's policy make sense? This sudden urgency of fighting a war in the absence of a fight? It did if one understood that the invasion was not about Saddam Hussein's evilness or his alleged weapons of mass destruction. When weeks of US military occupation of Iraq failed to uncover any such weapons, the White House declared that WMD were not, after all, the real reason for the invasion. What they were really doing, they assured the world, was delivering various blows to terrorism. "We were not lying," said one official, "but it was just a matter of emphasis." Amongst other reasons, the war was about the US replacing Hussein and installing a puppet government, as it did in Afghanistan. In this case, an American occupation government, enabling American oil companies to move into Iraq to enjoy a laissez-faire feast, at the same time opening the country to all manner of transnational corporations as Iraq takes its place in the new world order of globalized economies, and the American empire adds another country and a few more bases from which to further control and remake the Middle East in the Imperial Mafia's endearing amoral style, for which, presumably, the children of the region will sing great songs in years to come. US agreement to allow the UN weapons inspectors to return to Iraq in December 2002 had been no more than a bluff to cater to unexpectedly strong world opposition to Washington's planned invasion. 3 months of inspections before the invasion began turned up nothing in the way of unambiguously prohibited weapons. Over the course of about 7 years in the 1990s, the UN inspectors had found and destroyed huge amounts of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons in Iraq. Scott Ritter, chief UN weapons inspector in Iraq, stated in 2002 that since 1998, Iraq has been fundamentally disarmed. 90 to 95% of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction have been verifiably eliminated. This includes all of the factories used to produce chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons and long-range ballistic missiles, the associated equipment of these factories, and the vast majority of the products coming out of these factories. In the same period, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammed El-Baradei, reported that his agency had dismantled extensive nuclear weapons-related facilities. "We neutralized Iraq's nuclear program. We confiscated its weapon-usable material. We destroyed, removed, or rendered harmless all its facilities and equipment relevant to nuclear weapons production." This, then, was the alarming threat of Iraq which had to be wiped out, a society already terribly enfeebled by 12 years of sanctions, which U.S. National Security Advisor Samuel Berger called the most pervasive sanctions ever imposed on a nation in the history of mankind. U.S. foreign policy, a laboratory for growing the anti-American terrorism virus. We leveled it. There was nobody left, just dirt and dust. U.S. Army Major Gen. Franklin Hagenbeck, speaking of the destruction of 3 villages in the Shahiko Valley in Afghanistan. The American bombing of Afghanistan, begun on October 7, 2001 and followed by a military occupation of much of the country, gave rise to dozens of terrorist actions against American individuals and institutions, as well as Christian and other Western targets in South Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere. A dozen or so attacks in Pakistan alone, including the kidnapping and murder of Wall Street Journal correspondent Daniel Pearl, and the most disastrous one in Bali, Indonesia, on October 12, which killed more than 180 people, almost all Australians, Americans, or British. The two leading suspects arrested in that case each stated that he had acted in retaliation for the US attack on Afghanistan and Muslims. The subsequent attack on Iraq, a war nobody wanted except the Imperial Mafia, may have recruited thousands more throughout the Muslim world as the next generation of terrorists to carry out the jihad against the great Satan. Has the American power elite learned anything from being the frequent target of terrorism over the years? Here's James Woolsey, former director of the CIA and member of the Defense Department's Policy Board, speaking 2 months after the beginning of the US bombing of Afghanistan, advocating an invasion of Iraq and unconcerned about the response of the Arab world. The silence of the Arab public in the wake of America's victories in Afghanistan, Woolsey said, proves that only fear will reestablish respect for the US. In a similar light, a phrase attributed to various leaders of the Roman Empire has been used by Bush administration officials. Otter and Dummetuan, let them hate so long as they fear. The State Department may have learned something. At the time of the first anniversary of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attack and subsequently as well, the department held conferences on how to improve America's image abroad in order to reduce the level of hatred. But it's image they were working on, not change of policies. And the policy scorecard reads as follows. From 1945 to 2003, the United States attempted to overthrow more than 40 foreign governments and to crush more than 30 populist nationalist movements fighting against intolerable regimes. In the process, the US bombed some 25 countries, caused the end of life for several million people, and condemned many millions more to a life of agony and despair. The idea is to build an anti-terrorist global environment. A senior Defense Department official told the New York Times in 2003, so that in 20 to 30 years, terrorism will be like slave trading, completely discredited. The world can only wonder this. When will American wars of aggression, firing missiles into the heart of a city, and using depleted uranium and cluster bombs against the population become completely discredited? They already have become such, but the United States, which wages war on the same scale other nations apply to mere survival, does not yet know it. Instead, it practices perpetual war for perpetual peace.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is March 29, 2020.
The book we were listening to is called Killing Hope. Right now, I'm just looking for another audiobook before I continue with the yoga practice. I had some ideas. I'm either looking for something related or something that I haven't heard before.
Chapter 1, Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore, carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, brought them food, water, gifts. He later wrote of this in his log. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. These Arawaks of the Bahama Islands were much like Indians on the mainland, who were remarkable, European observers were to say again and again, for their hospitality, their belief in sharing. These traits did not stand out in the Europe of the Renaissance, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, the government of kings, the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization and its first messenger to the Americas, Christopher Columbus. Columbus wrote, "As soon as I arrived in the Indies on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts." The information that Columbus wanted most was, where is the gold? He had persuaded the King and Queen of Spain to finance an expedition to the lands, the wealth he expected would be on the other side of the Atlantic, the Indies and Asia, gold and spices. For like other informed people of his time, He knew the world was round and he could sail west in order to get to the Far East. Spain was recently unified, one of the new modern nation-states like France, England, and Portugal. Its population, mostly poor peasants, worked for the nobility, who were 2% of the population and owned 95% of the land. Spain had tied itself to the Catholic Church, expelled all the Jews, driven out the Moors. Like other states of the modern world, Spain sought gold, which was becoming the new mark of wealth, more useful than land because it could buy anything. There was gold in Asia, it was thought, and certainly silks and spices, for Marco Polo and others had brought back marvelous things from their overland expeditions centuries before. Now that the Turks had conquered Constantinople and the eastern Mediterranean and controlled the land routes to Asia, a sea route was needed. Portuguese sailors were working their way around the southern tip of Africa. Spain decided to gamble on a long sail across an unknown ocean. In return for bringing back gold and spices, they promised Columbus 10% of the profits, governorship over newfound lands, and the fame that would go with a new title, Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was a merchant's clerk from the Italian city of Genoa, part-time weaver, the son of a skilled weaver, and expert sailor. He set out with 3 sailing ships, the largest of which was the Santa Maria, perhaps 100 feet long, and 39 crew members. Columbus would never have made it to Asia, which was thousands of miles farther away than he had calculated, imagining a smaller world. He would have been doomed by that great expanse of sea, but he was lucky. 1/4 of the way there, he came upon an unknown, uncharted land that lay between Europe and Asia, the Americas. It was early October 1492, and 33 days since he and his crew had left the Canary Islands off the Atlantic coast of Africa. Now they saw branches and sticks floating in the water. They saw flocks of birds. These were signs of land. Then, on October 12th, a sailor called Rodrigo saw the early morning moon shining on white sands and cried out. It was an island in the Bahamas, the Caribbean Sea. The first man to sight land was supposed to get a yearly pension of 10,000 maravedis for life. But Rodrigo never got it. Columbus claimed he had seen a light the evening before. He got the reward. So, approaching land, they were met by the Arawak Indians, who swam out to greet them. The Arawaks lived in village communes, had a developed agriculture of corn, yams, cassava. They could spin and weave, but they had no horses or work animals. They had no iron, but they wore tiny gold ornaments in their ears. This was to have enormous consequences. It led Columbus to take some of them aboard ship as prisoners because he insisted that they guide him to the source of the gold. He then sailed to what is now Cuba, then to Hispaniola, the island which today consists of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There, bits of visible gold in the rivers and a gold mask presented to Columbus by a local Indian chief led to wild visions of gold fields. On Hispaniola, out of timbers from the Santa Maria which had run aground, Columbus built a fort, the first European military base in the Western Hemisphere. He called it Navidad, Christmas, and left 39 crew members there with instructions to find and store the gold. He took more Indian prisoners and put them aboard his 2 remaining ships. At one part of the island, he got into a fight with Indians who refused to trade as many bows and arrows as he and his men wanted. 2 were run through with swords and bled to death. Then the Nina and the Pinta set sail for the Azores and Spain. When the weather turned cold, the Indian prisoners began to die. Columbus's report to the court in Madrid was extravagant. He insisted he had reached Asia, it was Cuba, and an island off the coast of China, Hispaniola. His descriptions were part fact, part fiction. Hispaniola is a miracle. Mountains and hills, plains and pastures are both fertile and beautiful. The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers of which the majority contain gold. There are many spices and great mines of gold and other metals. The Indians, Columbus reported, are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. He concluded his report by asking for a little help from their majesties, and in return he would bring them from his next voyage as much gold as they need and as many slaves as they ask. He was full of religious talk. Thus the eternal God, our Lord, gives victory to those who follow his way over apparent impossibilities. Because of Columbus's exaggerated report and promises, his second expedition was given 17 ships and more than 1,200 men. The aim was clear: slaves and gold. They went from island to island in the Caribbean, taking Indians as captives. But as word spread of the Europeans' intent, they found more and more empty villages. On Haiti, they found that the sailors left behind at Fort Navidad had been killed in a battle with the Indians after they had roamed the island in gangs looking for gold, taking women and children as slaves for sex and labor. Now, from his base on Haiti, Columbus sent expedition after expedition into the interior. They found no gold fields, but had to fill up the ships returning to Spain with some kind of dividend. In the year 1495, they went on a great slave raid, rounded up 1,500 Arawak men, women, and children, put them in pens guarded by Spaniards and dogs, then picked the 500 best specimens to load onto ships. Of those 500, 200 died en route. The rest arrived alive in Spain and were put up for sale by the archdeacon of the town, who reported that, although the slaves were naked as the day they were born, they showed no more embarrassment than animals. Columbus later wrote, "Let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, go on sending all the slaves that can be sold." But too many of the slaves died in captivity, and so Columbus, desperate to pay back dividends to those who had invested, had to make good his promise to fill the ships with gold. In the province of Chicao on Haiti, where he and his men imagined huge gold fields to exist, they ordered all persons 14 years or older to collect a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. When they brought it, they were given copper tokens to hang around their necks. Indians found without a copper token had their hands cut off and bled to death. The Indians had been given an impossible task. The only gold around was bits of dust garnered from the streams, so they fled, were hunted down with dogs, and were killed. Trying to put together an army of resistance, the Arawaks faced Spaniards who had armor, muskets, swords, horses. When the Spaniards took prisoners, they hanged them or burned them to death. Among the Arawaks, mass suicides began, with cassava poison. Infants were killed to save them from the Spaniards. In 2 years, through murder, mutilation, or suicide, half of the 250,000 Indians on Haiti were dead. When it became clear that there was no gold left, the Indians were taken as slave labor on huge estates known later as encomiendas. They were worked at a ferocious pace and died by the thousands. By the year 1515, there were perhaps 50,000 Indians left. By 1550, there were 500. A report of the year 1650 shows none of the original Arawaks or their descendants left on the island. The chief source, and on many matters the only source, of information about what happened on the islands after Columbus came, is Bartolomé de las Casas, who as a young priest participated in the conquest of Cuba. For a time he owned a plantation on which Indian slaves worked, but he gave that up and became a vehement critic of Spanish cruelty. Las Casas transcribed Columbus's journal and in his 50s began a multi-volume History of the Indies. In it he describes the Indians. They are agile, he says, and can swim long distances, especially the women. They are not completely peaceful because they do battle from time to time with other tribes, but their casualties seem small, and they fight when they are individually moved to do so because of some grievance, not on the orders of captains or kings. Women in Indian society were treated so well as to startle the Spaniards. Las Casas describes sex relations. Marriage laws are non-existent. Men and women alike choose their mates and leave them as they please, without offense, jealousy, or anger. They multiply in great abundance. Pregnant women work to the last minute and give birth almost painlessly. Up the next day, they bathe in the river and are as clean and healthy as before giving birth. If they tire of their men, they give themselves abortions with herbs that force stillbirths. covering their shameful parts with leaves or cotton cloth. Although on the whole, Indian men and women look upon total nakedness with as much casualness as we look upon a man's head or at his hands. The Indians, Las Casas says, have no religion, at least no temples. They live in large communal bell-shaped buildings, housing up to 600 people at one time, made of very strong wood and roofed with palm leaves. They prize bird feathers of various colors, beads made of fish bones, and green and white stones with which they adorn their ears and lips. But they put no value on gold and other precious things. They lack all manner of commerce, neither buying nor selling, and rely exclusively on their natural environment for maintenance. They are extremely generous with their possessions, and by the same token, covet the possessions of their friends and expect the same degree of liberality. In Book 2 of his History of the Indies, Las Casas, who at first urged replacing Indians by black slaves, thinking they were stronger and would survive, but later relented when he saw the effects on blacks, tells about the treatment of the Indians by the Spaniards. It is a unique account and deserves to be quoted at length. Endless testimonies prove the mild and pacific temperament of the natives. But our work was to exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. Small wonder, then, if they tried to kill one of us now and then. The admiral, it is true, was blind as those who came after him, and he was so anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against the Indians. Las Casas tells how the Spaniards grew more conceited every day, and after a while refused to walk any distance. They rode the backs of Indians as if they were in a hurry, or were carried on hammocks by Indians running in relays. In this case, they also had Indians carry large leaves to shade them from the sun, and others to fan them with goose wings. Total control led to total cruelty. The Spaniards thought nothing of knifing Indians by 10s and 20s and of cutting slices off them to test the sharpness of their blades. Las Casas tells how 2 of these so-called Christians met 2 Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots and for fun beheaded the boys. The Indians' attempts to defend themselves failed, and when they ran off into the hills, they were found and killed. So, Las Casas reports, they suffered and died in the mines and other labors in desperate silence, knowing not a soul in the world to whom they could turn for help. He describes their work in the mines. Mountains are stripped from top to bottom and bottom to top 1,000 times. They dig, split rocks, move stones, and carry dirt on their backs to wash it in the rivers, while those who wash gold stay in the water all the time with their backs bent so constantly it breaks them. And when water invades the mines, the most arduous task of all is to dry the mines by scooping up pans full of water and throwing it up outside. After each 6 or 8 months' work in the mines, which was the time required for each crew to dig enough gold for melting, up to 1/3 of the men died. While the men were sent many miles away to the mines, the wives remained to work the soil, forced into the excruciating job of digging and making thousands of hills for cassava plants. Thus, husbands and wives were together only once every 8 or 10 months, and when they met, they were so exhausted and depressed on both sides, they ceased to procreate. As for the newly born, they died early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them. And for this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months. Some mothers even drowned their babies from sheer desperation. In this way, husbands died in the mines, wives died at work, and children died from lack of milk. And in a short time, this land, which was so great, so powerful and fertile, was depopulated. My eyes have seen these acts, so foreign to human nature, and now I tremble as I write. When he arrived on Hispaniola in 1508, Las Casas says, there were 60,000 people living on this island, including the Indians, so that from 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. Who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. Thus began the history, 500 years ago, of the European invasion of the Indian settlements in the Americas. That beginning, when you read Las Casas, even if his figures are exaggerations, were there 3 million Indians to begin with, as he says, or less than 1 million, as some historians have calculated, or 8 million, as others now believe, is conquest, slavery, death. When we read the history books given to children in the United States, it all starts with heroic adventure. There is no bloodshed, and Columbus Day is a celebration. Past the elementary and high schools, there are only occasional hints of something else. Samuel Eliot Morison, the Harvard historian, was the most distinguished writer on Columbus, the author of a multi-volume biography, and was himself a sailor who retraced Columbus's route across the Atlantic. In his popular book, Christopher Columbus, Mariner, written in 1954, he tells about the enslavement and the killing. The cruel policy initiated by Columbus and pursued by his successors resulted in complete genocide. That is on one page, buried halfway into the telling of a grand romance. In the book's last paragraph, Morison sums up his view of Columbus. He had his faults and his defects, but they were largely the defects of the qualities that made him great. His indomitable will, his superb faith in God and in his own mission as the Christ-bearer to lands beyond the seas, his stubborn persistence despite neglect, poverty, and discouragement. But there was no flaw, no dark side to the most outstanding and essential of all his qualities, his seamanship. One can lie outright about the past, or one can omit facts which might lead to unacceptable conclusions. Morison does neither. He refuses to lie about Columbus. He does not omit the story of mass murder. Indeed, he describes it with the harshest word one can use, genocide. But he does something else. He mentions the truth quickly and goes on to other things more important to him. Outright lying or quiet omission takes the risk of discovery, which when made might arouse the reader to rebel against the writer. To state the facts, however, and then to bury them in a mass of other information, is to say to the reader with a certain infectious calm, yes, mass murder took place, but it's not that important. It should weigh very little in our final judgments. It should affect very little what we do in the world. It is not that the historian can avoid emphasis of some facts and not of others. This is as natural to him as to the mapmaker, who in order to produce a usable drawing for practical purposes must first flatten and distort the shape of the earth, then choose out of the bewildering mass of geographic information those things needed for the purpose of this or that particular map. My argument cannot be against selection, simplification, emphasis, which are inevitable for both cartographers and historians. But the mapmaker's distortion is a technical necessity for a common purpose shared by all people who need maps. The historian's distortion is more than technical. It is ideological. It is released into a world of contending interests, where any chosen emphasis supports, whether the historian means to or not, some kind of interest, whether economic or political or racial or national or sexual. Furthermore, this ideological interest is not openly expressed in the way a mapmaker's technical interest is obvious. This is a Mercator projection for long-range navigation. For short-range, you'd better use a different projection. No, it is presented as if all readers of history had a common interest, which historians serve to the best of their ability. This is not intentional deception. The historian has been trained in a society in which education and knowledge are put forward as technical problems of excellence, and not as tools for contending social classes, races, nations. To emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as navigators and discoverers, and to de-emphasize their genocide, is not a technical necessity, but an ideological choice. It serves, unwittingly, to justify what was done. My point is not that we must, in telling history, accuse, judge, condemn Columbus in absentia. It's too late for that. It would be a useless scholarly exercise in morality. But the easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress, Hiroshima and Vietnam to save Western civilization, Kronstadt and Hungary to save socialism, nuclear proliferation to save us all, that is still with us. One reason these atrocities are still with us is that we have learned to bury them in a mass of other facts, as radioactive wastes are buried in containers in the earth. We have learned to give them exactly the same proportion of attention that teachers and writers often give them in the most respectable of classrooms and textbooks. This learned sense of moral proportion, coming from the apparent objectivity of the scholar, is accepted more easily than when it comes from politicians at press conferences. It is therefore more deadly. The treatment of heroes, Columbus, and their victims, the Arawaks, the quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress, is only one aspect of a certain approach to history in which the past is told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, leaders. It is as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance, as if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, the leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, represent the nation as a whole. The pretense is that there really is such a thing as the United States, subject to occasional conflicts and quarrels, but fundamentally a community of people with common interests. It is as if there really is a national interest represented in the Constitution, in territorial expansion, in the laws passed by Congress, the decisions of the courts, the development of capitalism, the culture of education, and the mass media. History is the memory of states, wrote Henry Kissinger in his first book, A World Restored, in which he proceeded to tell the history of 19th century Europe from the viewpoint of the leaders of Austria and England, ignoring the millions who suffered from these statesmen's policies. From his standpoint, the peace that Europe had before the French Revolution was restored by the diplomacy of a few national leaders. But for factory workers in England, farmers in France, colored people in Asia and Africa, women and children everywhere except in the upper classes, it was a world of conquest, violence, hunger, exploitation, a world not restored, but disintegrated. My viewpoint in telling the history of the United States is different, that we must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. Thus, in that inevitable taking of sides which comes from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, of the Mexican War as seen by the deserting soldiers of Scott's army, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young women in the Lowell textile mills, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines as seen by black soldiers on Luzon, the Gilded Age as seen by Southern farmers, the First World War as seen by socialists, the Second World War as seen by pacifists, the New Deal as seen by blacks in Harlem, the post-war American empire as seen by peons in Latin America, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can see history from the standpoint of others. My point is not to grieve for the victims and denounce the executioners. Those tears, that anger, cast into the past, deplete our moral energy for the present. And the lines are not always clear. In the long run, the oppressor is also a victim. In the short run, and so far human history has consisted only of short runs, the victims themselves, desperate and tainted with the culture that oppresses them, turn on other victims. Still, understanding the complexities, this book will be skeptical of governments and their attempts, through politics and culture, to ensnare ordinary people in a giant web of nationhood pretending to a common interest. I will try not to overlook the cruelties that victims inflict on one another as they are jammed together in the boxcars of the system. I don't want to romanticize them. But I do remember, in rough paraphrase, a statement I once read. The cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you will never know what justice is. I don't want to invent victories for people's movements, but to think that history writing must aim simply to recapitulate the failures that dominate the past is to make historians collaborators in an endless cycle of defeat. If history is to be creative, to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should, I believe, emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, occasionally to win. I am supposing, or perhaps only hoping, that our future may be found in the past's fugitive moments of compassion rather than in its solid centuries of warfare. That, being as blunt as I can, is my approach to the history of the United States. The reader may as well know that before going on. What Columbus did to the Arawaks of the Bahamas, Cortez did to the Aztecs of Mexico, Pizarro to the Incas of Peru, and the English settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts to the Powhatans and the Pequots. The Aztec civilization of Mexico came out of the heritage of the Mayan, Zapotec, and Toltec cultures. It built enormous constructions from stone tools and human labor, developed a writing system and a priesthood. It also engaged in, let us not overlook this, the ritual killing of thousands of people as sacrifices to the gods. The cruelty of the Aztecs, however, did not erase a certain innocence, and when a Spanish armada appeared at Veracruz, and a bearded white man came ashore with strange beasts, horses, clad in iron, it was thought that he was the legendary Aztec man-god who had died 300 years before with the promise to return, the mysterious Quetzalcoatl. And so they welcomed him with munificent hospitality. That was Hernando Cortez, come from Spain with an expedition financed by merchants and landowners and blessed by the deputies of God with one obsessive goal, to find gold. In the mind of Montezuma, the king of the Aztecs, there must have been a certain doubt about whether Cortez was indeed Quetzalcoatl, because he sent 100 runners to Cortez bearing enormous treasures, gold and silver wrought into objects of fantastic beauty, but at the same time begging him to go back. The painter Durer, a few years later, described what he saw just arrived in Spain from that expedition: a sun of gold, a moon of silver worth a fortune. Cortez then began his march of death from town to town, using deception, turning Aztec against Aztec, killing with the kind of deliberateness that accompanies a strategy, to paralyze the will of the population by a sudden, frightful deed. And so in Cholula, he invited the headman of the Cholula nation to the square. And when they came, with thousands of unarmed retainers, Cortez's small army of Spaniards posted around the square with cannon, armed with crossbows, mounted on horses, massacred them down to the last man. Then they looted the city and moved on. When their cavalcade of murder was over, they were in Mexico City. Montezuma was dead, and the Aztec civilization, shattered, was in the hands of the Spaniards. All this is told in the Spaniards' own accounts. In Peru, that other Spanish conquistador, Pizarro, used the same tactics and for the same reasons. The frenzy in the early capitalist states of Europe for gold, for slaves, for products of the soil, to pay the bondholders and stockholders of the expeditions, to finance the monarchical bureaucracies rising in Western Europe, to spur the growth of the new money economy rising out of feudalism, to participate in what Karl Marx would later call the primitive accumulation of capital. These were the violent beginnings of an intricate system of technology, business, politics, and culture that would dominate the world for the next 5 centuries. In the North American English colonies, the pattern was set early, as Columbus had set it in the islands of the Bahamas. In 1585, before there was any permanent English settlement in Virginia, Richard Grenville landed there with 7 ships. The Indians he met were hospitable. But when one of them stole a small silver cup, Grenville sacked and burned the whole Indian village. Jamestown itself was set up inside the territory of an Indian confederacy led by the chief Powhatan. Powhatan watched the English settle on his people's land, but did not attack, maintaining a posture of coolness. When the English were going through their starving time in the winter of 1610, some of them ran off to join the Indians, where they would at least be fed. When the summer came, the governor of the colony sent a messenger to ask Powhatan to return the runaways, whereupon Powhatan, according to the English account, replied, with no other than proud and disdainful answers. Some soldiers were therefore sent out to take revenge. They fell upon the Indian settlement, killed 15 or 16 Indians, burned the houses, cut down the corn growing around the village, took the queen of the tribe and her children into boats, then ended up throwing the children overboard and shooting out their brains in the water. The queen was later taken off and stabbed to death. 12 years later, the Indians, alarmed as the English settlements kept growing in numbers, apparently decided to try to wipe them out for good. They went on a rampage and massacred 347 men, women, and children. From then on, it was total war. Not able to enslave the Indians and not able to live with them, the English decided to exterminate them. Edmund Morgan writes in his History of Early Virginia, American Slavery, American Freedom. Since the Indians were better woodsmen than the English and virtually impossible to track down, the method was to feign peaceful intentions, let them settle down and plant their corn wherever they chose, and then, just before harvest, fall upon them, killing as many as possible and burning the corn. Within 2 or 3 years of the massacre, the English had avenged the deaths of that day many times over. In that first year of the white man in Virginia, 1607, Powhatan had addressed a plea to John Smith that turned out prophetic. How authentic it is may be in doubt, but it is so much like so many Indian statements that it may be taken as, if not the rough letter of that first plea, the exact spirit of it. I have seen 2 generations of my people die. I know the difference between peace and war better than any man in my country. I am now grown old and must die soon. My authority must descend to my brothers, Opichapan, Opichankano, and Katato, then to my 2 sisters, and then to my 2 daughters. I wish them to know as much as I do, and that your love to them may be like mine to you. Why will you take by force what you may have quietly by love? Why will you destroy us who supply you with food? What can you get by war? We can hide our provisions and run into the woods. Then you will starve for wronging your friends. Why are you jealous of us? We are unarmed and willing to give you what you ask. If you come in a friendly manner and not so simple as to know that it is much better to eat good meat, sleep comfortably, live quietly with my wives and children, laugh and be merry with the English, and trade for their copper and hatchets, than to run away from them, and to lie cold in the woods, feed on acorns, roots, and such trash, and be so hunted that I can neither eat nor sleep. In these wars my men must sit up watching, and if a twig break, they all cry out, "Here comes Captain Smith." So I must end my miserable life. Take away your guns and swords, the cause of all our jealousy, or you may all die in the same manner. When the Pilgrims came to New England, they too were coming not to vacant land, but to territory inhabited by tribes of Indians. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, created the excuse to take Indian land by declaring the area legally a vacuum. The Indians, he said, had not subdued the land, and therefore had only a natural right to it, but not a civil right. A natural right did not have legal standing. The Puritans also appealed to the Bible. Psalms 2:8. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. And to justify their use of force to take the land, they cited Romans 13:2. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. The Puritans lived in uneasy truce with the Pequot Indians, who occupied what is now southern Connecticut and Rhode Island. But they wanted them out of the way. They wanted their land. And they seemed to want also to establish their rule firmly over Connecticut settlers in that area. The murder of a white trader, Indian kidnapper, and troublemaker became an excuse to make war on the Pequots in 1636. A punitive expedition left Boston to attack the Narragansett Indians on Block Island, who were lumped with the Pequots. As Governor Winthrop wrote, "They had commission to put to death the men of Block Island, but to spare the women and children, and to bring them away, and to take possession of the island, and from thence to go to the Pequots, to demand the murderers of Captain Stone and other English, and 1,000 fathom of wampum for damages, etc., and some of their children as hostages, which if they should refuse, they were to obtain it by force." The English landed and killed some Indians, but the rest hid in the thick forests of the island, and the English went from one deserted village to the next, destroying crops. Then they sailed back to the mainland and raided Pequot villages along the coast, destroying crops again. One of the officers of that expedition, in his account, gives some insight into the Pequots they encountered. "The Indians, spying of us, came running in multitudes along the waterside, crying, 'What cheer, Englishmen? What cheer? What do you come for?' They, not thinking we intended war, went on cheerfully." So the war with the Pequots began. Massacres took place on both sides. The English developed a tactic of warfare used earlier by Cortez and later in the 20th century, even more systematically, deliberate attacks on non-combatants for the purpose of terrorizing the enemy. This is ethnohistorian Francis Jennings' interpretation of Captain John Mason's attack on a Pequot village on the Mystic River near Long Island Sound. Mason proposed to avoid attacking Pequot warriors, which would have overtaxed his unseasoned, unreliable troops. Battle as such was not his purpose. Battle is only one of the ways to destroy an enemy's will to fight. Massacre can accomplish the same end with less risk, and Mason had determined that massacre would be his objective. So the English set fire to the wigwams of the village. By their own account, "The captain also said, 'We must burn them,' and immediately stepping into the wigwam, brought out a firebrand, and putting it into the mats with which they were covered, set the wigwams on fire." William Bradford, in his History of the Plymouth Plantation, written at the time, describes John Mason's raid on the Pequot village. "Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces, others hewn through with their rapiers, so as they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was conceived they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof, but the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands, and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy." As Dr. Cotton Mather, Puritan theologian, put it, "It was supposed that no less than 600 Pequot souls were brought down to hell that day." The war continued. Indian tribes were used against one another and never seemed able to join together in fighting the English. Jennings sums up, "The terror was very real among the Indians, but in time they came to meditate upon its foundations. They drew 3 lessons from the Pequot War. 1. That the Englishmen's most solemn pledge would be broken whenever obligation conflicted with advantage. 2. That the English way of war had no limit of scruple or mercy. And 3. That weapons of Indian making were almost useless against weapons of European manufacture. These lessons the Indians took to heart." A footnote in Virgil Vogel's book, This Land Was Ours, 1972, says, "The official figure on the number of Pequots now in Connecticut is 21 persons." 40 years after the Pequot War, Puritans and Indians fought again. This time it was the Wampanoags, occupying the south shore of Massachusetts Bay, who were in the way and also beginning to trade some of their land to people outside the Massachusetts Bay colony. Their chief, Massasoit, was dead. His son, Wamsutta, had been killed by Englishmen, and Wamsutta's brother, Metacom, later to be called King Philip by the English, became chief. The English found their excuse, a murder which they attributed to Metacom, and they began a war of conquest against the Wampanoags, a war to take their land. They were clearly the aggressors, but claimed they attacked for preventive purposes. As Roger Williams, more friendly to the Indians than most, put it, all men of conscience or prudence ply to windward to maintain their wars to be defensive. The Indians certainly did not want war, but they matched atrocity with atrocity. When it was over, in 1676, the English had won, but their resources were drained. They had lost 600 men. 3,000 Indians were dead, including Metacom himself. Yet the Indian raids did not stop. For a while, the English tried softer tactics, but ultimately it was back to annihilation. The Indian population of 10 million that lived north of Mexico when Columbus came would ultimately be reduced to less than 1 million. Huge numbers of Indians would die from diseases introduced by the whites. A Dutch traveler in New Netherland wrote in 1656 that the Indians affirm that before the arrival of the Christians and before the smallpox broke out amongst them, they were 10 times as numerous as they now are, and that their population had been melted down by this disease, whereof 9/10 of them have died. When the English first settled Martha's Vineyard in 1642, the Wampanoags there numbered perhaps 3,000. There were no wars on that island, but by 1764, only 313 Indians were left there. Similarly, Block Island Indians numbered perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 in 1662, and by 1774 were reduced to 51. Behind the English invasion of North America, behind their massacre of Indians, their deception, their brutality, was that special powerful drive born in civilizations based on private property. It was a morally ambiguous drive. The need for space, for land, was a real human need. But in conditions of scarcity, in a barbarous epoch of history ruled by competition, this human need was transformed into the murder of whole peoples. Roger Williams said it was a depraved appetite after the great vanities, dreams and shadows of this vanishing life, great portions of land in this wilderness, as if men were in as great necessity and danger for want of great portions of land, as poor, hungry, thirsty seamen have after a sick and stormy, a long and starving passage. This is one of the gods of New England, which the living and Most High Eternal will destroy and famish. Was all this bloodshed and deceit, from Columbus to Cortez, Pizarro, the Puritans, a necessity for the human race to progress from savagery to civilization? Was Morrison right in burying the story of genocide inside a more important story of human progress? Perhaps a persuasive argument can be made, as it was made by Stalin when he killed peasants for industrial progress in the Soviet Union, as it was made by Churchill explaining the bombings of Dresden and Hamburg, and Truman explaining Hiroshima. But how can the judgment be made if the benefits and losses cannot be balanced because the losses are either unmentioned or mentioned quickly? That quick disposal might be acceptable. Unfortunate, yes, but it had to be done. To the middle and upper classes of the conquering and advanced countries. But is it acceptable to the poor of Asia, Africa, Latin America, or to the prisoners in Soviet labor camps, or the blacks in urban ghettos, or the Indians on reservations, to the victims of that progress which benefits a privileged minority in the world? Was it acceptable or just inescapable to the miners and railroaders of America, the factory hands, the men and women who died by the hundreds of thousands from accidents or sickness, where they worked or where they lived, casualties of progress? And even the privileged minority, must it not reconsider, with that practicality which even privilege cannot abolish, the value of its privileges when they become threatened by the anger of the sacrificed, whether in organized rebellion, unorganized riot, or simply those brutal individual acts of desperation labeled crimes by law and the state? If there are necessary sacrifices to be made for human progress, is it not essential to hold to that principle, that those to be sacrificed must make the decision themselves? We can all decide to give up something of ours, but do we have the right to throw into the pyre the children of others, or even our own children, for a progress which is not nearly as clear or present as sickness or health, life or death? What did people in Spain get out of all that death and brutality visited on the Indians of the Americas? For a brief period in history, there was the glory of a Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere. As Hans Koning sums it up in his book, Columbus, His Enterprise, for all the gold and silver stolen and shipped to Spain did not make the Spanish people richer. It gave their kings an edge in the balance of power for a time, a chance to hire more mercenary soldiers for their wars. They ended up losing those wars anyway, and all that was left was a deadly inflation, a starving population, the rich richer, the poor poorer, and a ruined peasant class. Beyond all that, how certain are we that what was destroyed was inferior? Who were these people who came out on the beach and swam to bring presents to Columbus and his crew? Who watched Cortez and Pizarro ride through their countryside? Who peered out of the forests at the first white settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts? Columbus called them Indians because he miscalculated the size of the earth. In this book, we too call them Indians, with some reluctance, because it happens too often that people are saddled with names given them by their conquerors. And yet there is some reason to call them Indians, because they did come, perhaps 25,000 years ago, from Asia, across the land bridge of the Bering Straits, later to disappear underwater, to Alaska. Then they moved southward, seeking warmth and land, in a trek lasting thousands of years that took them into North America, then Central and South America. In Nicaragua, Brazil, Ecuador, their petrified footprints can still be seen, along with the print of bison, who disappeared about 5,000 years ago. So they must have reached South America at least that far back. Widely dispersed over the great land mass of the Americas, they numbered approximately 75 million people by the time Columbus came, perhaps 25 million in North America. Responding to the different environments of soil and climate, they developed hundreds of different tribal cultures, perhaps 2,000 different languages. They perfected the art of agriculture and figured out how to grow maize, corn, which cannot grow by itself and must be planted, cultivated, fertilized, harvested, husked, shelled. They ingeniously developed a variety of other vegetables and fruits, as well as peanuts and chocolate and tobacco and rubber. On their own, the Indians were engaged in the great agricultural revolution that other peoples in Asia, Europe, Africa were going through about the same time. While many of the tribes remained nomadic hunters and food gatherers and wandering egalitarian communes, others began to live in more settled communities where there was more food, larger populations, more divisions of labor among men and women, more surplus to feed chiefs and priests, more leisure time for artistic and social work, for building houses. About 1,000 years before Christ, while comparable constructions were going on in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Zuni and Hopi Indians of what is now New Mexico had begun to build villages consisting of large terraced buildings nestled in among cliffs and mountains for protection from enemies, with hundreds of rooms in each village. Before the arrival of the European explorers, they were using irrigation canals, dams, were doing ceramics, weaving baskets, making cloth out of cotton. By the time of Christ and Julius Caesar, there had developed in the Ohio River Valley a culture of so-called mound builders, Indians who constructed thousands of enormous sculptures out of earth, sometimes in the shapes of huge humans, birds, or serpents, sometimes as burial sites, sometimes as fortifications. One of them was 3.5 miles long, enclosing 100 acres. These mound builders seem to have been part of a complex trading system of ornaments and weapons from as far off as the Great Lakes, the Far West, and the Gulf of Mexico. About AD 500, as this mound builder culture of the Ohio Valley was beginning to decline, another culture was developing westward in the valley of the Mississippi, centered on what is now St. Louis. It had an advanced agriculture, including thousands of villages, and also built huge earthen mounds as burial and ceremonial places near a vast Indian metropolis that may have had 30,000 people. The largest mound was 100 feet high, with a rectangular base larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. In the city known as Cahokia were tool makers, hide dressers, potters, jewelry makers, weavers, salt makers, copper engravers, and magnificent ceramists. One funeral blanket was made of 12,000 shell beads. From the Adirondacks to the Great Lakes in what is now Pennsylvania and Upper New York lived the most powerful of the northeastern tribes, the League of the Iroquois, which included the Mohawks, people of the flint, Oneidas, people of the stone, Onondagas, people of the mountain, Cayugas, people at the landing, and Senecas, great hill people. Thousands of people bound together by a common Iroquois language. In the vision of the Mohawk chief Hiawatha, the legendary Decanawida spoke to the Iroquois. We bind ourselves together by taking hold of each other's hands so firmly and forming a circle so strong that if a tree should fall upon it, it should not shake nor break it, so that our people and grandchildren shall remain in the circle in security, peace, and happiness. In the villages of the Iroquois, land was owned in common and worked in common. Hunting was done together, and the catch was divided among the members of the village. Houses were considered common property and were shared by several families. The concept of private ownership of land and homes was foreign to the Iroquois. A French Jesuit priest who encountered them in the 1650s wrote, "No poorhouses are needed among them, because they are neither mendicants nor paupers. Their kindness, humanity, and courtesy not only makes them liberal with what they have, but causes them to possess hardly anything except in common." Women were important and respected in Iroquois society. Families were matrilineal. That is, the family line went down through the female members, whose husbands joined the family, while sons who married then joined their wives' families. Each extended family lived in a long house. When a woman wanted a divorce, she set her husband's things outside the door. Families were grouped in clans, and a dozen or more clans might make up a village. The senior women in the village named the men who represented the clans at village and tribal councils. They also named the 49 chiefs, who were the ruling council for the five-nation confederacy of the Iroquois. The women attended clan meetings, stood behind the circle of men who spoke and voted, and removed the men from office if they strayed too far from the wishes of the women. The women tended the crops and took general charge of village affairs, while the men were always hunting or fishing. And since they supplied the moccasins and food for warring expeditions, they had some control over military matters. As George B. Nash notes in his fascinating study of early America, Red, White, and Black, thus power was shared between the sexes, and the European idea of male dominancy and female subordination in all things was conspicuously absent in Iroquois society. Children in Iroquois society, while taught the cultural heritage of their people and solidarity with the tribe, were also taught to be independent, not to submit to overbearing authority. They were taught equality in status and the sharing of possessions. The Iroquois did not use harsh punishment on children. They did not insist on early weaning or early toilet training, but gradually allowed the child to learn self-care. All of this was in sharp contrast to European values as brought over by the first colonists. A society of rich and poor, controlled by priests, by governors, by male heads of families. For example, the pastor of the Pilgrim colony, John Robinson, thus advised his parishioners how to deal with their children. "And surely there is in all children a stubbornness, a stoutness of mind arising from natural pride, which must in the first place be broken and beaten down, that so the foundation of their education, being laid in humility and tractableness, other virtues may, in their time, be built thereon." Gary Nash describes Iroquois culture. "No laws and ordinances, sheriffs and constables, judges and juries, or courts or jails. The apparatus of authority in European societies were to be found in the northeast woodlands prior to European arrival. Yet, boundaries of acceptable behavior were firmly set. Though priding themselves on the autonomous individual, the Iroquois maintained a strict sense of right and wrong. He who stole another's food or acted invalorously in war was shamed by his people and ostracized from their company until he had atoned for his actions and demonstrated to their satisfaction that he had morally purified himself. Not only the Iroquois, but other Indian tribes behaved the same way. In 1635, Maryland Indians responded to the governor's demand that if any of them killed an Englishman, the guilty one should be delivered up for punishment according to English law. The Indians said, "It is the manner amongst us Indians that if any such accident happen, we do redeem the life of a man that is so slain with 100 arms length of beads. And since that you are here strangers and come into our country, you should rather conform yourselves to the customs of our country than impose yours upon us." So Columbus and his successors were not coming into an empty wilderness, but into a world which in some places was as densely populated as Europe itself, where the culture was complex, where human relations were more egalitarian than in Europe, and where the relations among men, women, children, and nature were more beautifully worked out than perhaps any place in the world. They were people without a written language, but with their own laws, their poetry, their history kept in memory and passed on in an oral vocabulary more complex than Europe's, accompanied by song, dance, and ceremonial drama. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, intensity of will, independence and flexibility, passion and potency, to their partnership with one another and with nature. John Collier, an American scholar who lived among Indians in the 1920s and 30s in the American Southwest, said of their spirit, "Could we make it our own, there would be an eternally inexhaustible earth and a forever lasting peace." Perhaps there is some romantic mythology in that, but the evidence from European travelers in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, put together recently by an American specialist on Indian life, William Brandon, is overwhelmingly supportive of much of that myth. Even allowing for the imperfection of myths, it is enough to make us question, for that time and ours, the excuse of progress in the annihilation of races, and the telling of history from the standpoint of the conquerors and leaders of Western civilization. Chapter 2, Drawing the Color Line. A black American writer, J. Saunders Redding, describes the arrival of a ship in North America in the year 1619. Sails furled, flag drooping at her rounded stern, she rode the tide in from the sea. She was a strange ship, indeed by all accounts a frightening ship, a ship of mystery. Whether she was trader, privateer, or man of war, no one knows. Through her bulwarks, black-mouthed cannon yawned. The flag she flew was Dutch, her crew a motley. Her port of call an English settlement, Jamestown, in the colony of Virginia. She came, she traded, and shortly afterwards was gone. Probably no ship in modern history has carried a more portentous freight. Her cargo, 20 slaves. There is not a country in world history in which racism has been more important for so long a time as the United States. And the problem of the color line, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, is still with us. So it is more than a purely historical question to ask, how does it start? And an even more urgent question, how might it end? Or, to put it differently, is it possible for whites and blacks to live together without hatred? If history can help answer these questions, then the beginnings of slavery in North America, a continent where we can trace the coming of the first whites and the first blacks, imply at least a few clues. Some historians think those first blacks in Virginia were considered as servants, like the white indentured servants brought from Europe. The possibility is that even if they were listed as servants, a more familiar category to the English, they were viewed as being different from white servants, were treated differently, and in fact were slaves. In any case, slavery developed quickly into a regular institution, into the normal labor relation of blacks to whites in the New World. With it developed that special racial feeling, whether hatred or contempt or pity or patronization, that accompanied the inferior position of blacks in America for the next 350 years. That combination of inferior status and derogatory thought we call racism. Everything in the experience of the first white settlers acted as a pressure for the enslavement of blacks. The Virginians of 1619 were desperate for labor, to grow enough food to stay alive. Among them were survivors from the winter of 1609 to 1610, the starving time, when, crazed for want of food, they roamed the woods for nuts and berries, dug up graves to eat the corpses, and died in batches until 500 colonists were reduced to 60. In the journals of the House of Burgess of Virginia is a document of 1619, which tells of the first 12 years of the Jamestown colony. The first settlement had 100 persons who had one small ladle of barley per meal. When more people arrived, there was even less food. Many of the people lived in cave-like holes dug into the ground, and in the winter of 1609 to 1610, they were driven through insufferable hunger to eat those things which nature most abhorred, the flesh and excrements of man, as well as of our own nation, as of an Indian, digged by some out of his grave after he had lain buried 3 days, and wholly devoured him. Others, envying the better state of body of any whom hunger has not yet so much wasted as their own, lay wait and threatened to kill and eat them. One among them slew his wife as she slept in his bosom, cut her in pieces, salt her, and fed upon her, till he had clean devoured all parts saving her head. A petition by 30 colonists to the House of Burgesses, complaining against the 12-year governorship of Sir Thomas Smith, said, "In those 12 years of Sir Thomas Smith, his government, we aver that the colony, for the most part, remained in great want and misery under most severe and cruel laws. The allowance in those times for a man was only 8 ounces of meal and half a pint of peas for a day. Moldy, rotten, full of cobwebs and maggots, loathsome to man, and not fit for beasts, which forced many to flee for relief to the savage enemy, who being taken again were put to sundry deaths as by hanging, shooting, and breaking upon the wheel, of whom one for stealing 2 or 3 pints of oatmeal had a bodkin thrust through his tongue and was tied with a chain to a tree until he starved." The Virginians needed labor to grow corn for subsistence, to grow tobacco for export. They had just figured out how to grow tobacco, and in 1617 they sent off the first cargo to England. Finding that, like all pleasurable drugs tainted with moral disapproval, it brought a high price, the planters, despite their high religious talk, were not going to ask questions about something so profitable. They couldn't force Indians to work for them, as Columbus had done. They were outnumbered, and while with superior firearms they could massacre Indians, they would face massacre in return. They could not capture them and keep them enslaved. The Indians were tough, resourceful, defiant, and at home in these woods, as the transplanted Englishmen were not. White servants had not yet been brought over in sufficient quantity. Besides, they did not come out of slavery, and did not have to do more than contract their labor for a few years to get their passage and to start in the New World. As for the free white settlers, many of them were skilled craftsmen, or even men of leisure back in England, who were so little inclined to work the land that John Smith in those early years had to declare a kind of martial law, organize them into work gangs, and force them into the fields for survival. There may have been a kind of frustrated rage at their own ineptitude, at the Indian superiority at taking care of themselves, that made the Virginians especially ready to become the masters of slaves. Edmund Morgan imagines their mood as he writes in his book, American Slavery, American Freedom. If you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and they were savages. But your superior technology had proved insufficient to extract anything. The Indians, keeping to themselves, laughed at your superior methods and lived from the land more abundantly and with less labor than you did. And when your own people started deserting in order to live with them, it was too much. So you killed the Indians, tortured them, burned their villages, burned their cornfields. It proved your superiority in spite of your failures. And you gave similar treatment to any of your own people who succumbed to their savage